Welcome to People Places Planet Pod, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working to ensure a healthy environment, prosperous economies, and vibrant communities founded on the rule of law.
Environmental justice, a concept at the crossroads of environmental protection and social justice, dates back to the civil rights movement. It is defined by the Environmental Protection Agency as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Interest and urgency in advancing environmental justice, or EJ, has gained new momentum in recent years. The Biden-Harris administration has placed an unprecedented federal focus on environmental justice using a whole-of-government approach, including issuing executive orders demanding accountability and action from a broad list of federal agencies. In addition, a growing list of states continue to develop, implement, and enforce EJ-focused legislation, accelerated by the intensity at the federal level. In today's episode of the Groundtruth podcast series, Stacey Halliday of Beveridge Diamond will explore what's to come for environmental justice in 2022, with two EJ leaders at the Environmental Protection Agency, Charles Lee, Senior Policy Advisor, and Matthew Tejada, the Director of the Office of Environmental Justice. Charles and Matthew will share perspectives from their senior roles at EPA, how far the agency has come, how to contextualize the change that we are currently seeing, key goals for 2022, and best practices for those trying to incorporate EJ considerations into their work. Stacey, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Heather. I'm Stacey Halliday, shareholder at Beveridge Diamond, co-chair of the firm's Environmental Justice Practice Group, and a former Obama appointee at the United States Environmental Protection Agency's Office of General Counsel, where I had the privilege of working with Charles and Matthew. I had an opportunity to chat with each of these subject matter experts to get their perspectives on recent developments and what they think lies ahead for environmental justice. As Heather mentioned, Charles Lee currently serves as the Senior Policy Advisor for Environmental Justice at EPA, where he leads the development and implementation of EPA's agency-wide environmental justice strategic plan. He's been a leader in the EJ movement for over 3 decades. In 1987, when the term environmental justice was not yet common parlance, Mr. Lee served as the principal author of the seminal report Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, the first national study to examine the relationship between the geography and demographics of hazardous waste sites. He also organized the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. Matthew Tejada has served as the director of EPA's Office of Environmental Justice, or OEJ, since 2013. As director of OEJ, Matthew is responsible for overseeing not only the work of the office, but all of EPA's EJ efforts across the agency. Before his career at EPA, Matthew spent over 5 years in the nonprofit world as executive director of the environmental advocacy group, Air Alliance Houston, where he focused his efforts on EJ issues affecting communities in the Houston and Texas Gulf Coast areas, including region-wide ozone reduction policies and alleviation of toxic and particulate matter hotspots. So we'd like to use this episode to share key insights from what we've gleaned from each of our distinguished guests, starting with a retrospective look on where we've been in the environmental justice space. Both Matthew and Charles have the helpful perspective of years as EJ practitioners and witnesses to EPA's evolution in the space over time. So we asked them, what's changed? Is this time truly transformational? And got their thoughts. So let's see what they had to say. Charles, thank you so much for joining us. You have been involved in the environmental justice movement since the very beginning. For our listeners' benefit, Charles was the primary author on the landmark study Toxic Waste and Race in the United States in 1987, which provided the first concrete data on disproportionate impacts and showed the correlation between race and the siting of toxic waste. Since then, a lot has happened. What are your thoughts, Charles, on how environmental justice has progressed in the United States since the late 80s, and how has EPA's role and perspective changed now that you've been at the agency?
Boy, that's a big question. Thank you for the question, Stacey. And I guess that's a question spanning a lifetime almost now. You know, back in 1987, my main goal in terms of doing a report like Toxic Waste and Race was really to put the issue on the map, because at that time, most people did not even know what environmental justice is. And if you talked about the fact that communities of color and poor communities and tribal indigenous communities were impacted disproportionately in terms of environmental harms and risks. Everybody would look at you with a blank stare. People did not even know that such an issue in terms of the environment and how it impacted people, particularly certain groups of people, was really an issue. And I like to say, when I first started on this issue, it didn't really have a name. Environmental justice didn't have a name. And so if you fast forward to now, there's such an incredible sea change, both in terms of the ways that people understand and accept the fact that, the concentration of environmental burdens within certain communities and the lack of environmental amenities in those communities is a real policy issue. In fact, as we all know now, it is one of the central policy questions for the Biden-Harris administration. That came about with a lot of work that went into it. The ways that this has changed is, first of all, the fact that those communities are very much at the center of how to shape that agenda with the, establishment of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the strong voice of environmental justice leaders in helping to provide recommendations and, like I said, shape this agenda. On an intellectual level, in terms of knowledge about disproportionate environmental burdens and benefits, I mean, there's just so much more of an understanding of what that is. And like I said, in terms of the mainstream consciousness of Americans, that there's a knowledge and the acceptance that this is a serious issue, that this is something that cannot be ignored. We now know that, when we did toxic waste and race back in 1987, there were a handful of studies on the issue. And now there's hundreds, if not thousands, of peer-reviewed journal articles. There are university courses being taught in dozens, if not hundreds, of universities now. And so that's one on one level. On an institutional level, issue is one of the centerpieces at the very heart of the Biden-Harris agenda, an issue that's being embraced in other governmental entities like states and local governments. There's been some 40 to more than 40 states, as was last documented, have some kind of policy or program or activity around environmental justice. So there's been a real interest in it, and that's not at the federal level, it's a state level. And this is something that we're seeing. There's going to be an infusion of financial resources for environmental justice. That's just been seen through the funding at the federal level, through the American Rescue Plan, the forthcoming budget, the infrastructure bill, and this is a unprecedented, almost exponential increase.
And here Charles sums it up.
Are we witnessing something that's really transformational in terms of societal change with respect to environmental justice? I think I would say that I have never seen the kind of infusion of policy attention backed by financial resources and the kind of programming that's taking place. I have never seen that before. I have never seen the calling out the issues for what they are in terms of the roots of environmental injustice being rooted in things like systemic racism and openly kind of acknowledging and confronting that. I have never seen that before in my whole career. So those are just some of the examples about whether or not this is a transformational moment in terms of environmental justice and the history of the nation.
Matthew also shared reflections on how EPA's approach to EJ has evolved during his tenure at the agency.
From the original executive order that President Clinton signed back in 1994, Executive Order 12898, all the way through the executive orders that President Biden has signed since his time in office, even including executive orders signed on his first day in office, it has always been a clear mandate that all parts of the federal government, but especially EPA, really look to integrate environmental justice considerations across everything that we do, whether that is in a permitting context or rulemakings, our enforcement and compliance efforts, emergency or disaster response, engaging with communities, allocation of resources. For 30 years, we've been working to advance the practice of environmental justice across everything that EPA does. So we really look at that effort from within the EJ program as, well, we have to advocate amongst our colleagues for them to really understand and operationalize what does EJ mean for them. And we've had a lot of progress over that over the years in advancing that practice. But it's really today, I think, in the Biden-Harris administration and with the leadership of Administrator Regan, where for the first time, EPA is taking up the hardest pieces of that work, really looking at, okay, what does cumulative impacts mean in a permitting scenario? Really looking at, in a rule, fundamental decisions that we have to weigh when we're determining which rules or how to approach different rules.
As both Matthew and Charles mentioned, we've come a long way in terms of environmental justice, especially at the federal level. EPA recently released its draft strategic plan, which really showcases this progress. Matthew explained a bit more about the significance of the strategic plan.
I think this is a huge shift for the agency, just having environment, well, in a couple ways, right? Having a goal in the strategic plan on environmental justice is a big deal. I've had to work really hard in previous iterations of the agency's overall multi-year strategic plan just to get a couple sentences on EJ in there. We would hang our entire program on just 2 sentences in the strategic plan because you need that. And that's one of the things from the outside, right? A lot of folks look at these strategic plans, they're like, oh my Lord. But once you get inside of the agency, these multi-year strategic plans, like that is what dictates what goes into people's annual performance agreements and their performance reviews. It's what dictates what goes into budget requests. It's what dictates, the sorts of numbers and data and reporting that we share with Congress. These strategic plans are just that. It determines what the agency is going to do for the next few years. So having a goal central in that strategic plan that is not just about the EJ program, but is about what EPA overall has to do to move the ball on environmental justice, is that in and of itself is unprecedented and is a huge opportunity for the EJ program. The second facet of that is that this administration, I think for the first time, is really lifting up what a lot of folks on the outside have been demanding and pointing at for a long time, the relationship between the Environmental Justice Program and our External Civil Rights Compliance Program. So that's Title VI and other civil rights statutes, the actual compliance by EPA and by anybody that receives funding from EPA with those civil rights laws. There's a huge relationship there. And through the strategic plan, I think the administration is very clearly signaling that we're going to bring these 2 programs together, not to merge them. We still have very unique and important things that we do individually as an EJ program and an external civil rights program. They've made a lot of progress over the last few years taking care of a lot of the problems that people very rightly pointed to for a long time, such as the backlog of cases, that has been ameliorated. So we're for the first time in EPA's history, really able to look at a clean deck and say, all right, now we need to actually start doing the hard work of bringing our programs together in new and powerful ways to really help center the mission of the agency on advancing equity, justice, and rights across everything that we do.
Charles also weighed in on the significance of the plan and what it means for EPA.
It is not just any ordinary document. It is the document that that federal agencies use to hold themselves accountable to the kind of long-term goals and transformational changes that they see as necessary. So a couple of things about this is the strategic plan actually put forth a new principle in terms of how the EPA should carry out its mission of protecting human health and the environment. Heretofore, it's always been the rule of law, sound science, and transparency, and now there's achieving justice and equity as part of that. So that's the principle. That's goes right into what the DNA of EPA should be, in as far as like the ways that EPA should carry out its business. So that's one thing, and of course, a second thing is the fact that environmental justice and civil rights has become a strategic goal. And so before strategic plans focus on strategic goals that were more oriented towards things like air, water, or land or toxics, and these more media-oriented type of programs. But now there are these cross-cutting strategic goals like environmental justice and civil rights or climate change, addressing climate change. And it is worth noting that we are not just talking about just doing environmental justice, but we're talking about doing environmental justice alongside of our obligation to carry out our civil rights responsibilities.
In your view, how do you see climate justice and climate issues and the climate goals, the very ambitious ones that this administration has put forward, intersecting with environmental justice as we look ahead to 2022? What's the difference in climate justice and environmental justice, and how do these things work together?
I don't really see them as fundamentally being different. The issues of the environmental justice, looks at takes a very holistic approach towards understanding the environment and health of communities, and looks at them in terms of their ability to be healthy and sustainable and just and resilient. And so, just climate justice may just be a subset of that, but a very important component of that actually kind of interacts with all the other things, especially given the fact that the nature of climate change. And climate change being, as everyone now realizes, is an existential issue. It's going to have a much more greater impact in terms of how all parts of our environment and daily lives are going to be are going to take place, and how we're going to have to do business. So I don't see them as being separate. I see them maybe as having somewhat different focuses, but clearly, the issues of climate and other environmental issues and other public health issues, other issues related to infrastructure, and you can go on down the line, are going to merge together. And the paradigm shift is probably going to be, how do we address them all together?
We also spoke with Charles and Matthew about the role of data in EPA's approach to environmental justice, as monitoring and data have been a real central part of the Biden administration's platform and approach to achieving its goals of environmental justice. So how do you see the role of big data helping the agency achieve its goals? What do you see ahead in that space?
I think to back up a little bit, it was the ability to have demographic data in large data sets, and the ability to have environmental data in large data sets that actually gave rise, or was one of the things that gave rise to the environmental justice issue, as far as people's ability to understand, to perceive and understand it. A report like toxic waste and race would not have been possible without without those types of data sets, and a lot more of the kind of other studies which have become increasingly more sophisticated, and would not have been possible without those types of data sets. And I think we're just building on that. The tools like EJ Screen and cow and viral screening at the state level and other state tools, are going to make use of this. And the more I see these being incorporated into these mapping tools, in ways that are going to make them more accurate and sophisticated and able to account for factors that we really need. And how to there's a lot of challenges in terms of how to kind of make sure that we're keeping on top of this. But I see big data as being a really positive thing in terms of then the advancing these tools.
Matthew also had some important impressions and thoughts on the role of data in environmental justice.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge advocate for data. I'm a huge believer in data. The power of taking information and making it transparent, but also making it meaningful, making it kind of graspable by folks for different purposes, whether it's folks in the federal government or other levels of government, state and local or tribal levels, or just community members, right? Data can be so powerful for so many things. It can drive behavior change. It can drive accountability. So I think one of the things that we're very focused on is, there's a lot of development we can do with EJ Screen. There's a lot of things folks have been asking for since EJ Screen was first released back in 2015, that for the first time we have, both the leadership that is urging us to advance tools such as EJ Screen, as well as a little bit of money so that we can actually pay for those things to happen. But we're also cognizant that, EJ Screen, it's not going to do everything, right? EJ Screen does a lot of really important things, but it's not a one-stop, out of the box EJ analytical tool. There are other tools we need to create. There are other data sets that we really need to develop more consistently across the United States to be able to really analyze for issues of disproportionality, for issues of whether a community is overburdened or has an excess vulnerability to pollution, so that we can take the sort of information we have in EJ Screen, which is really still a screening tool, still to be used kind of at the front end of our work, at the front end of our thinking, to help inform engagement, to help inform research, to help inform, an investigation, and to take that sort of data and bring it not only into the center of our thinking, so that our decisions, our actions, the allocation of our resources are really based upon that data, but then also to continue and drive that data through to the other endpoint, which is, what is the result of that? What is the outcome of that? Did we change metrics on the ground? So I think there's a real continuum of being able to use equity and justice data in really powerful ways that I think this administration recognizes and is lifting that up. And one of the things that I know a lot of folks are very excited about is for the development by the White House of a climate and economic justice screening tool to help support implementation of the Justice 40 initiative. We're very much looking forward to that as well. I think that'll be an exciting new tool out there, a very different tool from what EJ Screen is today. And I think we'll see a proliferation. I mean, even just this past summer of 2021, our colleagues in the Office of Air and Radiation, they released a new tool that was looking at power plant emissions and the impact of power plant emissions from an equity perspective. I think you're going to see a proliferation of these tools. And the most exciting part of it is not the tools that we will craft at the federal level, because there's always going to be an inherent limitation for national tools, because the United States is a big place and it's a diverse place, and trying to create a tool that looks across the entire United States, it's tougher than most people think unless they've tried it. But I think we're seeing states, local government, academic institutions, just communities developing their own tools. And when you look at the sort of information, the sort of data that you can get when you go further and further down, closer to the ground, those tools are really exciting. So I think we'll see just a real growth year over year in how people look at these sorts of data, how people look at the visualization or the other tools that can be derived from them, and also, the very real and important ways that different levels of government, or maybe even, private industry, starts to grapple with the results of these tools and actually change the way we think, change the way we behave, change the decisions we take based upon what these tools show us.
And both Matthew and Charles emphasize the importance of a variety of different stakeholders playing important roles in furthering and advancing environmental justice. And I know many of our listeners are in-house practitioners trying to think about how they incorporate environmental justice into everyday operations. We do that a lot. That's most of the work that we do with our environmental justice practice at Beveridge Diamond, and counsel our clients on how to proceed and incorporate EJ into their work. So we made sure to ask Charles and Matthew what role they see for industry in supporting agency goals for environmental justice and advancing what maybe their own goals internally at their companies. Here's Charles. As you know, my bailiwick is more of advising industry actors and companies on how they incorporate environmental justice into their ESG and corporate sustainability efforts. And I'm curious, just because many of our listeners are in that space, what sort of best practices or pieces of advice might you share with in-house practitioners who are seeking to incorporate environmental justice into their work?
Well, I think first of all, there are corporate policies that talk about the need to be good neighbors and engage with their communities, and there are a lot of best practices in terms of how to do community engagement, and that starts with not just doing it because you have to, or you just because you want to get a permit application through or whatever, but to build real relationships with the communities and really understand the kind of issues that are there. And so, so that's one thing that I would just say as far as, good practices to emulate. The second is, more and more, it is really important to understand the kind of history of these communities and the historical legacy of how racism and other systemic inequities have kind of played a role in shaping the ways these communities are organized and what kind of benefits and burdens they have to deal with, and so the ability of companies to better understand the substantive concerns of communities before they make decisions is going to be important, and that's part and parcel of the kind of engagement and research that should be going on all the time if there's going to be sound corporate governance and on environmental and community issues.
And Charles elaborated on ways that the agency could work with the business community to advance environmental justice.
We need to work more with the business community to promote what are some really important good ideas in terms of social governance and sustainability and being, good neighbors. These are the kinds of things that are going to be important if we're going to make the kind of changes that we need to address environmental justice or end the kind of disproportionate impacts in certain communities if we're going to make them real and long-lasting.
And here's Matt's take.
I think there's a huge responsibility on all of us, whether we are private citizens working for private industry, whether we are advocates or academics out on the ground, or whether we are civil servants at any level of government, to recognize the history of environmental injustices, to recognize the history of structural and systemic racism that has resulted in so many communities across the United States still struggling with challenges of pollution, with lack of access to whether it is economic justice or transit justice or healthy food or a clean environment. that those communities with those challenges did not happen by accident. It was not a matter of circumstance. It's not the fault of the community members for just not choosing a better place to live. We created these communities. We created and accumulated the negative things that exist in their communities at a far greater preponderance than in other communities, in wealthier communities or whiter communities. It is all of our responsibility to do something about that. It is also really important, I think, that the private sector understand that even though engaging in these environmental justice conversations and making progress on environmental justice from their private sector standpoint is tough, it is uncomfortable, it means taking a seat at a table that you did not help to set necessarily, which doesn't happen all that often for private industry. I come from Houston. I advocated in Houston. I've sat in countless rooms that industry arranged, and I know how uncomfortable it is for them when they have to sit in a room that they did not. But that is where we're at in our society and in our government in the United States today. Is that is everyone's responsibility to take your seat at that table. But it's important for them to understand that the leaders of the environmental justice movement have for a very long time recognized that business and industry have played a major role in creating the injustices, but that we absolutely have to have their participation to seek justice. They have to be at the table. It is why, like, for instance, on the NEJEC, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, why we have representation of business and industry and always have on the NEJEC. They have got to be in the room. They have got to be at the table. The power dynamic is different, again, from what they would typically experience, but we need them there. And that's part of also the core philosophy of the EJ program at EPA is that everything we do is done from a collaborative problem-solving philosophy. And to have a viable collaboration, you have to have partners such as business and industry with you collaborating to identify the issues and identify the solutions based upon the community's vision, based upon the community's reality, and to come together around that community and in support of that community to try to achieve their vision of what a healthy, prosperous, safe environment looks like for the future of their community. So I urge business and industry to continue to seek that out, to seek us out. I've had more conversations with more Fortune 100 companies in the last 6 months than I have since I left Houston. I know there's a lot of interest. So at EPA, our EJ folks are here to engage with them, to help them engage with their communities, to have hard conversations about the reality of what it might mean for private sector, depending upon what industry area they're in. But they are absolutely necessary partners to this, and we need them. We need private industry to have the courage to show up, to take a seat, to open their ears and minds and listen, and really be ready to come to that table, ready to deal in ways that I think typically industry has declined to do for a very long time.
Now, as we close out 2021 and look ahead to the next year, here's what our speakers see on the horizon for environmental justice from their positions at EPA.
It's hard to say to talk about like one thing in 2022 because, we've been discussing and, we've all been hearing about the kind of massive change in terms of transformational possibilities for environmental justice in 2022. And so I don't know if there's one thing that, one central development. I think all these kind of feed on top of each other. The one area that I think that, we all need to start to do is to better integrate environmental justice into the regulatory process. And that has to do with really knowing how to analyze for disproportionate impacts and really address this question around cumulative impacts and communities, getting a handle on how to analyze for them, and then how to kind of integrate that into the way we do business. And I don't think there's going to be any one simple solution to that. But I think that would be like, an area where, all of us should be thinking about in terms of like an area where it's been really kind of hard, I think, in terms of environmental justice, progress over the past 30 years or so. The integration of environmental justice in the regulatory process has always been the area that we've always found most challenging. So this is an opportunity to look squarely at that and see if we can, make some headway there.
Obviously, a lot of folks are watching New Jersey. They're the first state to have a very clear law on cumulative impacts and making sure that their environmental permitting program starts to really, again, do the hard work of figuring out how, for the state of New Jersey, how they can issue permits or not issue permits based upon an environmental justice analysis that's really looking at the cumulative impacts of a community and trying to determine where is that disproportionality. That's something we're obviously very, very interested in at EPA. It's why there are two different commitments in our draft strategic plan, which is out this fall of 2021 for public comment. So we're hopeful that upcoming in January, February, we'll be finalizing this and actually starting to implement it. But there are two different commitments we have in there for advancing our understanding of disproportionality. That was maybe the most critical term in the original EJ Executive Order 12898, this idea of disproportionality, but it was probably the most important term, and we probably made the least amount of progress on really pinning down what do we mean by disproportionality. What do we do with disproportionality? What is the relationship, which I think is a very close relationship between disproportionality and cumulative impacts? I think the biggest part of disproportionality is cumulative impacts. So how do we define cumulative impacts? How do we analyze for that? How do we actually, once we've analyzed for it and we've described it and we've come up with a more consistent way of even just describing it, what is the application of that to our permitting system? What is the application of that to a NIPDES permit versus a PSD Clean Air Act permit? Right? There's a lot of things we have to figure out there. What is the relationship of that understanding of disproportionality when we look at our formal agreements with states who take or tribes that take over or stand in the shoes of EPA with our delegated authorities, right? How do we make sure that we're able to communicate a consistent understanding and application of these very critical terms so that it's not just EPA figuring out how to operationalize this, but we really are looking across the entire environmental regulatory endeavor of the United States. And I think that's a really powerful way to start to operationalize EJ itself. I think environmental justice as a term or as an idea, even after being around for decades, it's still received as a mystical, mythological, maybe frightening. Not maybe. A lot of folks are still frightened by it, right? EJ, it's this clandestine thing that is hard to pin down. It's really not, right? EJ is about which communities are disproportionately burdened, which have too much of the bad stuff and not enough of the good stuff, and they're more vulnerable to it. And once you start thinking about it in that term, I think that starts to demystify for a lot of folks who are maybe reticent of approaching EJ. If you can get them thinking about, well, there are communities out there, right, that are getting too much pollution, right? It's probably not a safe place to live. There's probably too many sources, or maybe there's only one source, but it's too great of a source for any one community to have to, shoulder that burden. how do we make sure their health is being protected? How do we make sure they have access to a clean, safe environment? And once you start breaking it down in those ways, I think a lot more folks, whether at the state level, local government, or our tribal partners, start to see, oh, okay, well, what can we do with that? How can we look at the Clean Air Act differently? How can we use our authorities in the Clean Water Act, or in FIFRA, or in CERCLA, or in RCRA, to make sure that those communities whose health and environments are not protected to the same level as many other communities, how can we advance their protection? How can we make sure they enjoy the same benefits that so many other communities already enjoy?
And that's our show. Big thanks to Charles, Matthew, and the team at EPA for facilitating these conversations and sharing these important insights during this unprecedented time for environmental justice. As I noted earlier, we provided highlights from our chats during this episode, but if you're interested in listening to the interviews in full, please go to www.bdlaw.com, where we have extended interviews available. Thank you all for joining us for this first year of Groundtruth. Wishing you all a wonderful end of 2021 and look forward to joining you again in 2022.
Thank you for tuning in to People, Places, Planet Pod, brought to you by the Environmental Law Institute. We would like to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and ideas to podcast@eli.org. And if you're interested in learning more about our work, attending one of our events, reading our publications, or becoming a member, please visit our website at www.eli.org.